Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. The gym is packed. The Whole30 is in. The juice cleanse is alive and well. The budget is tightened up. Happy New Year, everybody. Behind every face in this room is a resolution, a bright-eyed best intention, represented by the new beginning that comes along with the turning of the calendar. We're all scheming and planning our own blessing, a more ideal set of circumstances than the one we ended 2024 with. And so you might be interested to know that Jesus also has an opinion on where blessing can be found. Matthew chapter 5, which we read from a moment ago, this is the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous and dense block of teaching. And the opening lines that we read are typically called the Beatitudes. That comes from the Latin translation of the New Testament, a Latin word that typically means happy or blessed. And so it makes sense that each of these statements translated into English begins with the identical phrase, "Blessed are those who." But, and this is so very important, the word blessed in the Beatitudes is not the word translated as the blessing of God that is found frequently elsewhere in the scriptures. The English word blessed here in this passage is the Greek term makarios, which is a word used all over both Jewish and pagan literature from the time of Jesus, but it's a very difficult word to translate into English because we honestly don't have an equivalent term in our language. Most translators opt for blessing, but that's a misleading translation because this refers to more of a surface than a soul level blessing. It's more like a circumstantial blessing or even a stroke of good luck than it is a spiritual blessing. And so other translators prefer happy are those who, or fortunate are those who, even lucky are those who. Paraphrase translations will often use a phrase like, throw a party when. Makarios in Jesus' day was less an adjective to describe a circumstance, and it was actually a salutation to begin a conversation. And because of that reason, a lot of scholars argue that the best equivalent English term we have, and it's still not perfect, it's probably the closest we can get, is congratulations. When something great happens to you in Jesus' world, someone would say, Makarios! Makarios on the promotion or the graduation or the new baby or the marriage. Congratulations. Blessed are you. The Beatitudes are so provocative then because Jesus is using a celebratory term for something good and applying it to exactly the opposite sets of circumstances that it usually gets applied to. Congratulations, you're poor in spirit. You're grieving a loss. You're meek or unimportant. Do you see how polarizing this is? How offensive, or at least confusing. The Beatitudes, I believe, are among Jesus' most important and misunderstood teachings, especially for those of us in the modern West. So let's begin with what this isn't. This isn't a list of virtues. Some read the Beatitudes like Jesus is ascribing virtue to surprising character traits, like a spiritualized version of it's a better to give than to receive sort of thing. And that works to some degree with the second half of the Beatitudes. This list of sayings is typically divided into two halves or sometimes three triads, depending on how you count the last one. But there's a very clear distinction, which is even clearer in Greek, in the first four and the latter four. Each of these groups is exactly 36 words. The first four all start with the same Greek letter. In other words, we can see from the literature that this isn't a haphazard list of sayings. It's more like very carefully crafted poetry. And when you get to lines like, the merciful will be shown mercy, the pure in heart will see God, it sounds virtuous. But you've got to do linguistic gymnastics to turn the first four into virtues. Let's start from the top. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To turn that into a virtue, you'd interpret it like the poor in spirit are those who live with this internal sense of poverty and are always aware of their deep need for God. And if that were what Jesus said, then we'd probably all nod in agreement. The only problem with that translation is it's not what Jesus said. Jesus just said poor. There are two ancient Greek words for poor. One is penes, which means the working poor. It's kind of like how we'd say living paycheck to paycheck. Jesus didn't use that word. The word Jesus used is patokos, which means hand to mouth. It is a word picture for living right on the brink of starvation. It's similar to what we would say living below the poverty line, only our version is much more polite. That's the word Jesus uses, abject poverty. But Jesus adds to it in spirit. And in the Bible, a person's spirit refers to their life breath or their inner vitality. So if your spirit is poor, you're lacking vitality and a sense of inner energy. Jesus is describing someone who is both economically poor and lacking the power to do anything about their situation. It's the single mother of four working 3 hourly jobs without benefits to the tune of 80 hours a week, all just to keep a little bit of food on the table for her growing children. No time to go back to school and pursue something different or go on a job search and find a different career path. She is grinding to get through this week, every week, and there's no digging herself out of this hole. So the most straightforward interpretation is probably something like, blessed are the poor and powerless. Congratulations when you're living hand to mouth and lack the power to do anything about it. Now, is poverty a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing. This isn't a trick question I'm luring you into to make you look foolish in front of the person sitting next to you. It's a bad thing, right? Poverty is about so much more than just the number on your bank account. It's about that, but it's also about your resources, your education, your opportunity, your access to choice. And I don't believe that Jesus calls any of that good. This isn't virtuous, it's tragic. And Jesus says, congrats. What's going on here? This also isn't a list of commands. Those who confuse the Beatitudes with virtues then often take it a step further and assume that we are meant to pursue the statements that are on this list. So let's try that as we continue reading. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. One of the members of my community, one of my closest friends, who I walk arm in arm with, lost her husband and her oldest child. And in the last 18 months, she's been estranged from her only son. And if you were to approach her and ask, have you been divinely comforted in your grief? She would say, absolutely. God is my comfort. And if you were then to go on to ask, well, then should I actively pursue or hope for loss in my own life so that I might meet the same comfort that you've met? She would say, absolutely not. God really is a comforter with the power to meet us in and even redeem our pain. But God is the author of blessing, not of cursing. He designed a world without grief of any kind, and so he certainly doesn't command us to hope for or actively pursue it. These are not commands. And then finally, this isn't a list of proverbs. Proverbs are countercultural wisdom sayings. A well-known cultural proverb is actions speak louder than words. In other words, talk comes easy and it costs us little, but to take action, well, that requires intention and it costs me something. And so if you want to know what you really believe or what you really deeply value, you should pay more attention to your actions than you do to the words coming out of your mouth. It's a poetic turn of phrase to reveal deep wisdom in just a few words. A well-known biblical proverb is, faithful are the wounds of a friend, meaning you can trust someone who loves you enough to tell you a hard truth. In fact, the willingness to gently, compassionately say a hard truth to someone else is a sign of true friendship. You should be suspicious of flattery, and you should keep close the people that know you, love you, and aren't impressed by you, all at the same time. Again, a poetic turn of phrase, communicating a deep truth in just a few words. Proverbs sound contrarian, like the Beatitudes. So they've got that much in common, right? Actions speaking, friends wounding. It doesn't sound right because it's meant to be chewed on and pondered in order to reveal truth. So maybe that's what Jesus is doing. He's rattling off proverbs for us to chew on. But that logic doesn't work either. Read on. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Our friends over at the Bible Project, they translate this, blessed are the unimportant, rather than the word meek. And that's because the ancient Greek word that's used here is less about personal humility, and it's more about having no influence socially, being looked down on and discarded by the movers and shakers in society. And occasionally, you'll come across an amazing underdog story about an overlooked person who gets elevated to a leadership position of honor and influence. But come on, that's the exception, not the rule. Who is it that gets the promotion, the bonus, the leadership position, the wealth? Isn't it the charismatic, the ambitious, the successful? Did Jesus pay any attention to our recent presidential election? I wasn't beholding a ton of meekness from anyone trying to run the world, were you? These aren't timeless truths. They're not proverbs. Beatitudes, this one-line sort of teaching format, it was a very common form of rabbinical teaching. The way Jesus introduces the Sermon on the Mount was very provocative, but at least the style of the teaching that he brought was not entirely original to Jesus. In fact, there's 46 other instances of the use of Beatitudes in the broader Hebrew canon. Let me read one to you from Sirach, which is Hebrew canonical literature. In other words, this is in the Catholic Bible. I can think of 9 whom I would call blessed, and a 10th my tongue proclaims, a man who can rejoice in his children. So yeah, that sounds like blessing, right? This is the same sentiment that we read in Psalms 127 and 128. A man who lives to see the downfall of his foes. Touch cringy, but it's a totally different time and culture, so I get it. Happy is the man who lives with a sensible wife. Now, if you haven't noticed, it's always going to be a man. Men were the much more obvious recipients of blessing in ancient society. And the one who does not plow with an ox and an ass together. Of course, who hasn't been there? Am I right? Don't even get me started on last Saturday. Happy is the one who does not sin with his tongue, and is the one who has not served an inferior. Happy is the one who finds a friend, and the one who speaks to attentive listeners. How great is the one who finds wisdom, but none is superior to the one who fears the Lord. Old Sirach really saves it right there at the end. Now, this list might read somewhat comical, but at least these things sound like blessings, don't they? They sound like the sort of circumstances that we might call blessed. So I took a shot at my own adaptation. Now, what I'm about to read you is not from the Greek. This is not an accurate translation of the Bible. It is just my attempt to drag the real effect of these words into terminology that we might hear and understand. So here's my creative adaptation of Jesus' Beatitudes. Congratulations to those on welfare, those waiting in line at food banks, the overworked and underpaid. If discovering your calling is a distant fantasy and bringing home diapers and formula that is this week's big dream, you're blessed, because my kingdom is all yours. Congratulations to those wailing loudly in funeral halls, those quietly grieving another miscarriage, those carrying the daily weight of depression, because there's a comfort coming that will wipe away every tear from your eye. And to the quiet ones, the gentle ones, the overlooked, unsought after, even taken advantage of, you're lucky. You're first in line to receive the only kind of power you can keep. If your stomach growls with hunger pangs for justice, fair wages for every worker, a fair trial for every accused, fair opportunities regardless of where you were born, if your throat is dry from crying out, "How long, O Lord?" because you're still waiting on equity, that hunger and thirst is a sign that you're really alive, really seeing, and really on your way to satisfaction. Congratulations to those who offer forgiveness when a grudge would be justifiable, to those who refuse to write anyone off. Even him, even her. Congratulations to those who hang on to innocence, who resist the corruption of cynicism, who don't find rest in overindulgence or their status in exaggeration. That common resistance pushes back the darkness and makes way for glory. You're blessed when you choose the path of peace, when you offer your left cheek because your right one's already bruised, when you keep dignifying even the ones who degrade you because you bear a striking resemblance to your heavenly Father. Congratulations if you've been mocked, excluded, misunderstood, judged, or typecast because of the name of Jesus. It's only because you're a stranger here. The kingdom of heaven is your home, and it's not waiting on you to find it. Your home is coming to find you. The crowd on the mountainside gathered for the Sermon on the Mount after they heard Jesus' intro. They'd be thinking, should I be intrigued enough to stick around to see where he's going with this? Or should I storm off in protest? The Beatitudes is not a list of virtues, commands, or proverbs. Well, what is it then? This is a welcome, a promise, and a commissioning. First and foremost, the Beatitudes are a welcome. Jesus gathers up the powerless, grieving, and unimportant, the justice seeker, mercy giver, and pure-hearted, the peacemaker and the persecuted, and then welcomes them as first in line to the kingdom that never ends. It's like he's swimming through the crowd, listening to him teach, past the elite and respected and accomplished to pick out the nobody, the barely hanging on, the overlooked and unimpressive, also that he can grab them by the shoulders and say, "This kingdom of mine, it's for you." Hey, you, your life's a mess. You're deeply sad and there is no light pricking the end of the tunnel. You're at the end of your rope and you're just about to crack. This kingdom, it's for you. It's that single mother of 4 working those 3 jobs to the tune of 80 hours a week, exhausted and standing somewhere at the back of Jesus' crowd, and then he spots her face between everyone else and says, "Oh, it's you. I've been looking for you. My kingdom, it's for you." It's the addict in recovery who lost touch with his kids 10 years ago because he was never the father they deserved, who lays awake at night wondering if they look like him, if they ever think about him, if they'll ever accept his apology. And Jesus says, "My kingdom, it belongs to you." It's the Ukrainian teenage refugee who overnight went from passing notes to his girlfriend in class, to a relative's home in another village, then to a government holding facility, and then finally caught the big break. The opportunity to start all over in a city that I got placed in at a new school, learning a new language, navigating a new culture, all because someone in power wanted to flex. And Jesus says, "I haven't forgotten you. It's the furthest thing from that. I've been chasing you down. Welcome, come on in, sit down at my table." Jesus has this habit everywhere he goes of picking out the objectively least likely person and saying, "My kingdom belongs to you." He goes out of his way to find the powerless, gathering up a group of blue-collar fishermen and then welcoming in a woman at a well in Samaria, a leper with 2 sisters in the village of Bethany. His kingdom is for the grieving, a mother who lost her only child, a synagogue leader whose 12-year-old's on her deathbed, and a father who's riddled with doubt in God but full of love for his epileptic son. and the ashamed, a woman who was caught in adultery, Levi sitting there behind the tax collector's booth, a blind man who's been ostracized from his community and now his family. And even in resurrection victory, it was a grieving, previously demonized woman, one with a stained reputation that Jesus selected as the first witness to the kind of life that outlives death. The last will be first and the first will be last. That's the order of this king's reign. And that means that if you walked into this room today and when you stepped into this crowd, you felt invisible or unaccomplished or like you didn't belong or didn't measure up, Jesus is swimming through this crowd to pick you out and say, first. You are first in line for the kingdom that never ends. So come on in, sit down in the place of honor, and share in the feast with the rest of us. This is a welcome. And it's a promise. In fact, it's a twofold promise, one with a future and a present piece to it. And so I want to slow our roll a touch here so that we can be sure to see it from both angles. First, the Beatitudes are a future promise. Can I just state the obvious for us? The Beatitudes are only good news if Jesus really is king. Right? Poverty's only happy if a new economy really is on the way. And grief is only blessed if comfort's coming to entirely swallow it up. And powerlessness is only fortunate if the power scale can be reversed or at least rebalanced. The Beatitudes are only good news if Jesus really is king. Otherwise, he's a lunatic making a bunch of promises he can't keep, or maybe worse than that, he's a con man manipulating the emotions of the most vulnerable. Jesus is unleashing a series of future promises for the most presently destitute. Let's just zoom in on the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The poor in spirit are only blessed today if the kingdom of heaven really is coming for them in the future. Well, what's the kingdom of heaven? All the way back to the beginning of the story on page 1 of the Bible, heaven and earth weren't separate realities. They were one and the same. If you ask Adam and Eve what heaven is like, that would be like asking a fish what water's like, or you and I what breathing's like. It's hard to describe because it's all we've ever known. It's life itself. There was no separation between God and people, between heaven and earth, until this thing called sin drove the two apart. And every condition Jesus names in the Beatitudes, it wasn't God's idea. It was the separation of what God joined together. Sin, the human demand to play my own God, to get control over my own life, to design my own future, the need to be both director and leading actor in my own drama, that's what caused all this mess. The mission of God is to reunite what sin separated. The Bible is not an epic story about getting people into heaven. The Bible is an epic story about getting heaven back to earth. And so the Bible ends like it started, with heaven and earth reunited as one. It ends like it started, only better. Because the potential within the garden, which was made possible when God imprinted his divine image on people, was to cultivate that wild garden into a garden city. And that's where the story ends. When Jesus announced the kingdom of God, he was announcing his kingship. He was claiming to be the long-awaited one who could bring this story to its promised end. The Beatitudes are wildly insensitive and completely delusional unless Jesus really is who he said he is. In the Beatitudes, Jesus is offering us a way to bear with our present circumstances in light of his promised future. Hope. There's this one scene in The Lord of the Rings when Frodo is summoned to destroy the One Ring in the fire of Mount Doom. And Sam Gamgee asks, how could the end be happy when so much bad has happened? And I remember that moment in the film because I watched the movies without ever reading the books or knowing the story. And I watched the movies sitting on my family couch next to my little brother who had read the books and watched all the movies a number of times. And I remember this moment because I'm on the edge of my seat and he's leaned back yawning. Why? Because he knows the end of the story. That's the gift of hope that Jesus is giving us in the Beatitudes. The ability to relax and trust even at the darkest turns in our own stories. Hope is not naivete. It's not an uncontested life like a journey that doesn't have any bumps in the road. Hope is the certainty of the destination in spite of the fact that this is a very winding and profoundly bumpy journey that I'm on. Hope is the promise of Psalm 112. Surely the righteous will never be shaken. They will be remembered forever. They will have no fear of bad news. Their hearts are steadfast, trusting in the Lord. Can you imagine living that way? Without fear of bad news? With a relaxed, content, and at peace way of being in any and every circumstance? With a psyche that doesn't rise and fall on the collage of the most immediate circumstances that have come intruding into my life? A way of being that is more resilient than today's very legitimate causes for anxiety. Hope. That's the only force that can sustain such a life. You who's grieving today, comfort is coming for you. You unimportant today, honor is coming for you. You unsatisfied and discontent today, satisfaction is coming for you. You poor and powerless to dig yourself out of that pit, I'm reaching in to pull you up. Jesus is offering every last one of them, every last one of us, a promised end to the story and to my story that redefines everything, even the bleak, tragic scene I might be living in today in light of a future coming hope. You and I have been steeped, though, in an alternative narrative of future hope. That narrative goes like this: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's the founding mantra of America. It's the bedrock philosophy of the increasingly westernized world. Our culture is built on the unrestrained pursuit of happiness, according to my definition of happiness. We habitually then put our hope in a future set of circumstances that we imagine happiness awaits us. What is happiness? It's the outcome of this interview process or the end of next semester. Happiness is when I get to move into a bigger home or a more livable city. It's when we finally have kids, or when the kids are all in school, or when the kids are finally all out of the house, or when the kids finally have kids so we can have kids back in the house. Right? It never ends. The forever assumption that the best is yet to come. That future in my imagination that we think holds happiness or blessing that today lacks. It leads us to this assumption that I'm always just one adjustment or adaptation or addition or life hack or new experience or next accomplishment or change away from breakthrough, and then life happens. I graduate and the work turns out to be unfulfilling and the office culture is toxic and the boss is really crude. Or he finally puts a ring on my finger. And it was good for a while. But now I've lost myself or him, or we're just different people than we were. And what if this version of me doesn't love this version of him? And I don't say it that way out loud, but that's probably the truest version of what plays in the back of my head. Or the pregnancy test finally comes back positive. And then my pregnancy was awful, and my delivery was traumatic. And now I'm up several hours every night breastfeeding an infant about whom my most honest emotion is resentment. And I'm afraid to admit to myself, much less anybody else, that my big dream has been a big disappointment. Or I retire and the party was amazing, and here I am 6 months later, and everything I worked decades to accomplish, everything that was toasted to so poetically at the party, it's all forgotten in the wake of new business and new plans and new people. And retirement feels less like sailing off into the sunset and more like being forgotten in the life I'm still living. Happiness, according to my definition, it's always too small to begin with and too slippery to hold on to for any length of time. We're people of hope, but people who habitually vest our hope in a future that is way too small. So we've got to reacquaint ourselves with a hope big enough to hold the weight of our souls. Hope that God really is the author of the story and my story, and he's read me the last page of both. It's Dostoevsky's line of the brothers Karamazov. I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage. That in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, for all the blood we've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. That's hope. That's the gift Jesus is offering to us in the Beatitudes. And those who fix their attention on that future get to experience it right now in the present. There's a present promise here too. Notice that while the middle 6 Beatitudes are all in the future tense, the first and the last one are present promises. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not will be, is. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. A series of future promises are bookended and held together by promises to taste that promised future right here and now in the present. The biblical paradox known as the now and not yet is summarized and held in the Beatitudes. The promise that God will fully and finally bring his kingdom in Christ's return, yes, absolutely, but for those who bow their knee to this king. There's also a promise to know that kingdom in part right now while we're waiting on his return. The surprise of the Beatitudes, though, is where Jesus says his kingdom is experienced presently. He says it's in the midst of poverty of spirit, in the midst of undeserved persecution. In other words, in the midst of the very part of your life you would never choose, that's where my kingdom is coming to you. A few weeks ago, I got a text from a friend. I'll read it to you verbatim. Hey man, I wanted to see if you have any time to connect Friday. I want to discuss something important with you, but feel like it needs some space. And probably not best over phone. When I read that text, I didn't think, wonderful. This must be good news or a compliment that this person wants to make sure they get to deliver in person. Now, what happens when you get a text like that? The bottom drops out of your stomach, and if you're anything like me, you immediately start thinking, oh no. What did I do wrong, and why am I completely unaware of it? It was Gerald. That's who sent me that text. Gerald's one of my closest friends and closest co-workers. My life could not be more intertwined with his. A couple days before I received the text, I had taken a spiritual retreat. I got 2 nights away at a monastery to get quiet with God amid a very noisy and busy season, and this doesn't always happen, but on this particular retreat, I had this clear and profound encounter with God, and I returned with this deep, light, joyful sense that God was pointing me to immediately coming blessing, like I was falling headfirst into the very blessing of God. Makarios! And then this happened. And so I start thinking, well, I've clearly done something to upset Gerald. I've done something significant enough that we need to have a face-to-face over it, something that I am entirely ignorant and unaware of, all while I'm off listening to whispers of divine blessing? Like, did I completely miss it, God? Am I delusional? Am I telling stories to myself? Which is it? Am I blessed or am I blind? Am I on the receiving end of good or bad news? Now, fortunately, I had a monthly spiritual direction appointment the very same afternoon that I got that text. And so I'm explaining all of this to my spiritual director, who I've been seeing monthly for more than 6 years now and who knows me very well. And he brought up a comparable situation. He reflected back to me a moment from my own life a couple years prior when I had wronged a friend, not in a big way, but something small that I had noticed, and I recognized it, and I went to that friend and apologized. And he reminded me of that whole circumstance and then said, "How did you experience that, Tyler? How did you experience being at fault and needing forgiveness from someone that you know loves you?" And the most honest thing came out of my mouth. It was so honest, it surprised me. I said, "I hated it." I hated it. Because even though he forgave me, I didn't feel entirely safe in his presence afterwards. I was sure that in some way I had been redefined in his imagination by my faults, that the bubble had burst on who he thought I was, and he still tolerated me. But who I had tried to convince him I was, or maybe who I was trying to convince myself that I am, that person was gone forever. And then he said, "Tyler, where do you think that comes from?" And this memory just leapt to my mind, one from my marriage, of a time when I thought I was forgiven, but I wasn't. A time when I received forgiveness with joy, only to discover later, much later, years later, that I wasn't forgiven. That we'd moved on, but that I had been redefined by my fault, and that we had a lot of work to do. I'm afraid of needing forgiveness from Kirsten or Gerald or Jesus. Tyler, you know the scriptures backwards and forwards. So you know that in the Bible, blessing is profoundly tied to the experience of God's forgiveness. What if you're not delusional? What if you are falling headfirst into blessing? What if blessing is your need for God's forgiveness and God's willingness, even God's willingness through Gerald, to offer you the forgiveness that you're afraid of needing? The next morning I had coffee with Gerald. I had wronged him and I was totally blind. And he forgave me and he meant it. And we both wept because he loved me, not my false self that I keep trying to convince the whole world and myself that I am, or at least that I can become, because he loved my true self, my imperfect, flawed, utterly reliant on forgiveness, actual self. And it was exactly there at the coffee meeting I would have done anything to avoid being at that I experienced the presence of God 10 times more profoundly than I did on that monastery retreat. And there's a word for that. Blessed. About a month ago, I caught up with an old friend. He's the father of 2 now. 7-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter, Nora, who lives with Down syndrome. And I was asking him about that, about the experience of raising a child with a developmental disability. And he said, "Well, when my wife was pregnant with Nora, I remember leaving the appointment where they told us of her diagnosis. And for a while, I was just confused. Like, why this and why her? I was confused by the injustice of it all, the total randomness of it all. Stunned and staggering and coming to terms with the fact that this was, I guess, going to be our family's story. And then after the confusion came this period of uncertainty. If confusion was questioning the past uncertainty, if confusion was questioning the past, uncertainty was questioning the future. It just seemed unfair that she was going to have to enter an already challenging world with an additional set of challenges and hurdles. Every explanation that I had had before for the justice of God that made sense of the world as I had known it suddenly felt so flimsy in light of my own daughter's diagnosis. And then after questioning and uncertainty, it all just gave way to grief, and that stayed the longest. I began to grieve all that I'd never get to do with her. Like help her move out of the house, and visit her at her first ratty apartment downtown, walk her down the aisle, or hold her own child and see her be a mother. And as he explained it all, I remembered this moment a few years back when I was in Charleston visiting my folks, and I was in vacation mode. And anyone who knows me at all knows that there's nothing I love more than dinner time. And so I remember spending the hours of the morning just scheming and daydreaming about the perfect dinner that evening. And now I was at the grocery store picking up the necessities, and the guy who bagged my groceries, he had a noticeable developmental delay. And when I walked out to the car, he followed me out into the parking lot to wrangle up the stray shopping carts. And as we both walked into the parking lot, this older lady runs up to him and says, "Thomas, how's it going? Do you need anything? Did you remember to eat your lunch?" It was his mom. She'd been waiting in the parking lot to see him. And in that moment, as I took in the scene between the two of them, I started to think about her life, about the excitement of announcing that she was pregnant, and then about that doctor's appointment where they told her, and about the confusion and uncertainty and grief that peeled her open in the months that followed, and about the life that she thought she was going to live and the life that she has found herself actually living. And now here she is, passing an entire afternoon in a grocery store parking lot because her son, who's probably in his mid-30s, he looked about my age at the time, is working his first day at his first job. And so she's spending an 8 to 10 hour shift in a grocery store parking lot waiting for the moments that he'll walk out to wrangle the carts just to check on him, to see him, to make sure he's okay. And as I watched it all, I thought, I don't know what it is to love someone that completely. And I knew that the joy that I was trying to chase down through the perfect vacation dinner, she was feasting on through a self-giving kind of love that endures forever. And there's a word for that, for the suffering kind of love freely and unconditionally offered to another person. Blessed. Makarios. So my friend's telling me about the experience of parenting a developmentally disabled child, the confusion, uncertainty, and grief. And then he says, now? Oh, now Nora's my favorite person in the world. I don't know if you're allowed to say that, but everyone in my family, we all love each other so much, but we'd probably all say that because there's something special about her. To be with her at her pace and on her terms, is to get an unexpected glimpse into the kingdom of God. Joni Eareckson Tada, whose medical journey has given hope to millions, was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer in 2018. That's cancer on top of an already lifelong tragic medical history. And she recently wrote about this one day when her husband Ken was driving her to another round of chemotherapy. We were talking about how suffering's like little splashovers of hell, waking us up out of our spiritual slumber, and we pulled into the hospital, and he said, "Then what do you think splashovers of heaven are? Are they those easy breezy times where everything's going your way, where you have your health?" And I said, "No. Splashovers of heaven are finding Jesus in your splashovers of hell. And to find Jesus in your hell is ecstasy beyond compare." The invitation to the Beatitudes is this: to look for God in the very places you're trying to escape or avoid, because he reigns even or maybe even especially right there. So this, family, is the introduction to a teaching series. It's a deep dive into the Beatitudes that we'll be in for the next couple months. And I hope as we make our way through, you will allow yourself to grow in hope for the future promise. But even more, I hope that you will discover yourself blessed in the present, in exactly the place where you are hurting. But today I want to close with this. The Beatitudes are a welcome, they're a promise, and they are a commissioning. Jesus, as he teaches the Sermon on the Mount, is a peasant claiming to be a king. It's kind of comical. And how does this peasant king plan to put his kingdom into operation? Through the equally unlikely people that he's promising his kingdom to. His kingdom reigns through the lives of the poor, the meek, the persecuted, and the oppressed. To these people Jesus is gathering up, he's also saying, now go, show the world what it's like when I'm king. When the single mother of 4 working 3 jobs is welcomed into a community that helps her break the cycle of poverty she's trapped in, that's what it looks like when Jesus is king. And when a recovering addict who lost touch with his kids 10 years ago is welcomed into a community that can share in his shame so that he can be healed from the internal narrative that he tells himself, and a community that might help free him from that condemnation and maybe even make peace with his own children, that's what it looks like when Jesus is king. And when the Ukrainian refugee teenager wakes up in a world not his own, is thrust into a restart that he had no say in, finds a community of people who see him and seek him and welcome him and know him and love him, that's what it looks like when Jesus is king. This is a commissioning. Weeping at the blessing of God in exactly the place that I was trying to avoid, my own need for forgiveness, that's what it looks like when Jesus is king. Grieving the diagnosis of a child, and then that child becoming the very place that I know God's presence nearest and am formed by Jesus most. That's what it looks like when Jesus is king. Driving to another chemotherapy appointment and realizing that somewhere along the way, too gradually for me to notice all at once, Jesus has splashed my hell with his heaven. That's what it looks like when Jesus is king. This is a commissioning. In the words of N.T. Wright, this is what it looks like today when Jesus is running the world. This is, after all, what he told us to expect. The poor in spirit will be making the kingdom of heaven happen. The meek will be taking over the earth so gently that the powerful don't notice until it's too late. The peacemakers will be putting the arms manufacturers out of business. Those who are hungry and thirsty for God's justice will be analyzing government policy and legal rulings and speaking up on behalf of those at the bottom of the pile. The merciful will be surprising everybody by showing that there's a different way to do human relations other than being judgmental, eager to put everyone else down. Jesus was announcing a program yet to be completed. He was inviting his hearers then and now, that's us, to join him in making it happen. This is, quite simply, what it looks like when Jesus is enthroned. The Bible is not an epic story about getting people into heaven. It is an epic story about getting heaven to earth by first getting heaven into people who spread it over every square inch.